Alright, let's get started. My name is Joshua Little. I recently completed my PhD at the University of Oxford, and my thesis was entitled The Hadith of Aisha's Marital Age, a study in the evolution of early Islamic historical memory. So this was a study of the famous or infamous Hadith about how the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was a girl of 6 or 7 and consummated the marriage with her when she was a girl of 9. At least that's the most common or one of the more common versions of the Hadith. Now, if you want sort of context of how I came to study this Hadith and also a discussion around some of the modern debates and social debates and implications and so on of this Hadith, then there is a previous recording on the Impactful Scholar YouTube channel where we discuss all of that. And if you're also interested in general in sort of critical secular approaches to Hadith, then there's another session on the same channel. But for this session, I'll just be giving a presentation of my thesis, a summary of the, what I covered and some of the arguments and the evidence and the basic conclusions. Now, this won't be comprehensive, the thesis, the full thesis will be available at some point, and I'll put that on my blog, islamicorigins.com. So when it's available, you'll be able to see it there. But, in the meantime, I thought I would at least give a bit of a summary. So there will be some, there's going to be some arguments and evidence I'm going to have to skip over. So you'll find all of that in the full thesis itself. So that'll be available at some point. Keep an eye on my blog or on my Twitter at Islamic Origins. And so, okay. So just to give a quick summary of the basic conclusion, the basic thesis, if you will, I argue that the Hadith of the marital age of Aisha, this famous Hadith, I argue that it can be traced back to her grandnephew, Hisham ibn Urwa ibn Zubair, the son of Urwa, who was the nephew of Aisha. And I argue that Hisham created this Hadith when he moved to Iraq. He came from Medina, he moved to Iraq, and so I argue that's when he created the Hadith, and it spread from him to his contemporaries in Iraq, and then from them all around the empire. And I argue that it was created in the polemical milieu, the sectarian milieu of early Abbasid Iraq, which is to say in the mid to late 8th century CE. And so this is a very basic summary of the thesis and or of the conclusions in the thesis. So with that said, let's get into it. And firstly, an overview of what we'll be covering. So there's a literature review, which is just where I go over all the sort of prior scholarly assessments of the authenticity or of the the dating of this Hadith. And next I look at methods and debates. So this is just looking at all the scholarly debates over, in general, how we can date Hadith, how far back we can reconstruct any given Hadith and so on. Next, I implement an Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. This is a sort of textual critical methodology, which I'll explain, when we get to it. And I apply an Isnād-cum-Matn analysis to all available versions of this Hadith and see how far back we can reconstruct it. Who are the earliest figures to whom we can reconstruct versions of this Hadith. After that, I subject those results, the results of the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, to a further deeper set of analyses: form criticism, geographical analysis, historical critical analysis, and I'll go into more detail about that when we get there. So I'm just going to subsume all of that under critical analysis. And then after that, I give a sort of summary of all the findings in terms of where the Hadith came from and how it spread and how it diversified and sort of, acquired other forms along the way. Then I summarize the reception of this Hadith by the early Sunni Hadith scholars and thereby how the Hadith was accepted as sound or sahih by the traditional scholars and became canonical. It entered into the Sunni Hadith canon. And finally, I explore some of the broader implications of this research and my conclusions for early Islamic history, Hadith studies, and so on. So yeah, this is a quick little overview of what we'll be covering, and in other words, what my thesis covers. Alright, so first up we have the literature review, and this is just a survey of some of the notable assessments of the authenticity of the marital age hadith. And so this is by no means exhaustive. There are other sort of scholars and discussions of the hadith beyond these, but what I tried to do, because what I discovered pretty quickly when looking at the literature was that often people are just repeating what earlier people have said, and they aren't really adding much to it. So what I tried to do was to find the earliest notable articulations of any given viewpoint, if that makes sense. And so this is just a selection of notable or early articulations of various viewpoints. So just to quickly summarize, so first we have Mumtaz Mu'in, who argues that there are conflicting hadiths that entail or imply a different chronology of Aisha's life and a different age of marital consummation, and thus the hadith is inauthentic. The information that it reports about the life of Aisha is wrong. It's contradicted. I'm very critical of this line of argumentation, however, because the chronology of the earliest phase of Islamic history, the life and times of the Prophet, is notoriously unreliable. There's been a lot of scholarship talking about this, secular critical scholarship, and it just seems clear that there wasn't, at the very beginning, there wasn't a consistent sort of system of recording dates and chronology and so on, and that this develops at a secondary point. And so there's just a lot of contradictions. And even in this material, I've seen people using this kind of argumentation, but then variously concluding that, Aisha's marital age, her age of marital consummation was, it was actually 12 or 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. You just find this whole spectrum of conflicting, rival, ages that are being inferred from different conflicting hadiths or chronological indicators in the traditional sources. And that automatically shows that, the material is not reliable, So I think it's a very sort of weak kind of basis on which to criticize this hadith, because it's essentially relying upon, quite unreliable material. So in general, I reject that kind of argumentation and that kind of criticism of the Aisha hadith. I don't think it follows merely from the fact that there are some hadiths that you can find that entail or imply a conflicting chronology, or a conflicting age, that therefore this hadith is wrong. Maybe this hadith is correct and the other, given sort of conflicting hadiths contain the erroneous chronologies, for example. Okay, next we have Muhammad Nasiruddin al-Albani, who's a very famous 20th century Salafi hadith scholar, and he argues that this hadith is sound, it's sahih, and he cites several different versions of the hadith, several different transmissions. Next we have T.O. Shanavas, and he argues in an article written for a magazine that actually the hadith was created by Hisham ibn Urwa after Hisham moved to Iraq, and that it's not cited by, certain Medinan sources or transmitters, and that there are reports that Hisham became unreliable when he moved to Iraq, and that he became, senile or, mixed up in his old age. Now, I basically agree with Shanavas. I think that the basic thesis here is correct, and this is what I argue, as I already mentioned, that it does go back to Hisham, and, specifically after Hisham moved to Iraq. However, first of all, Shanavas is only looking at a tiny sort of fraction of the available hadiths and reports and transmissions and so on. And so, it's an extremely... His conclusions were not justified based on the evidence that he had at his disposal. He only looked at a tiny fraction of the material. There are many more isnads and so on that seemingly bypass Hisham that you actually have to account for example. So even though I end up agreeing with his conclusion, I'm sort of critical of the way that he got to that conclusion, given how limited, the evidence was that he looked at. Also, he appeals to this report about, Hisham becoming senile. I'm very critical of those kinds of reports. As Eric Dickinson has argued, these kinds of reports, these sort of conditional appraisals, so-and-so was reliable until, his library was destroyed, or he, fell off his mount, or he went blind, or he became senile. These kinds of conditional appraisals, often you'll actually find several, Dickinson documents some examples of this. You'll find several conflicting conditional appraisals for the same scholar. I mean, the simple explanation for that is there isn't actually a genuine memory that the person changed. People are looking at their transmissions, their extant transmissions, and some are good and some are bad, and for whatever reason they want to, explain this in a way that doesn't just generally impugn the scholar, right? Because you might just say, okay, well then the scholar is mixed, sometimes they're reliable and sometimes they're not. So they want to assign the reliable transmissions to one phase and the unreliable transmissions to another phase. And so then they come up with an explanation. They're speculating, they're guessing, they're inferring what could explain this. Why is there a shift like this, the first phase, the second phase? And then they're just speculating something like, it was they lost access to their books, or they went blind, or they hit their head, or what have you. And the fact that there are these conflicting accounts like that shows that people are, different people are coming up with different explanations for a common problem. So there isn't actually a genuine memory. So therefore, I would be very wary of relying upon a report like this about Hisham, given this kind of problem in general with those kinds of reports. But, as I said, the basic conclusion articulated by Shanavas about the Iraqi origin is one that I end up supporting in this thesis. Next we have Gautier Joinbol, famous Dutch hadith scholar, and he actually argued that this hadith was authentic. However, he didn't really give a strong argument for it, and in fact, if you apply his own methodology consistently, you actually would end up at my conclusion, which is that the hadith originated with Hisham and spread from Hisham. This is if you actually apply his sort of criterion of dense corroboration or criterion of dense transmission. He doesn't use that phrase, but this is his methodology, and we'll come to that later, in the presentation, exactly what his approach was. But essentially, I argue that if he actually applied his own method consistently, he wouldn't have actually come to that conclusion. So I think there's sort of an internal inconsistency on his part in that. In any case, I disagree with Joinbol, as we'll see. Next we have Muhammad Salih al-Munajjid, and well, I don't actually know if it was al-Munajjid himself, but it's an article on his website, so it could be written by him, it could be written by his team, I'm not actually 100% sure, or it could be written by someone under his supervision, but just for shorthand I'll say al-Munajjid. I'll treat him as the author. And in this article, al-Munajjid collects a huge amount. It's probably the most comprehensive collation of versions and transmissions and so on of this hadith that I came across. And so, it's a very sort of large array of all these different versions of the hadith, all obviously arguing that, the argument obviously is that the hadith is sahih, the hadith is sound, right? And so all of these numerous seemingly independent isnads and so on are all being adduced to try and argue to that effect. And we'll come back to this later on when we evaluate all the isnads and all the versions, and we'll see how that pans out. But another kind of argument that al-Munajjid uses is sort of an inverse of the one I mentioned at the outset, which is to try and find corroborating sort of chronological indicators that would show that actually, Aisha was consummated, at age 9. But I think that a similar kind of problem will apply to these as with the others. This kind of information is generally quite unreliable. And in fact, in the case of Aisha, very likely this sort of information, like, for example, statements in the biographical sources say about how old she was when she died, this is going to be based on the Aisha Hadith itself, plausibly, right? Like, it's like completely reasonable to think that actually the Hadith itself is what's being used to generate this kind of information. So it can't be established as somehow independent corroborating information. So I think it's a very weak kind of, I just don't think it's corroboration at all. So, that aspect of the argumentation, I think, is basically, unsound. Okay, next we have Kesha Ali. She doesn't go into detail on this, but she mentions, she's mostly focused on the legal usage of the Hadith, but she does talk about a possible motive for the creation of the Hadith, even though she seems to be sort of skeptical of it, but she does suggest a possibility, which is that the Hadith was created to justify legally young marriage. Next we have Hussein Abdurrauf, who gives similar considerations to Shanavas. And then we also have Salahuddin al-Idlibi, who was a Syrian, sort of a recent Syrian Sunni Hadith scholar. And he actually also makes a similar argument to the first one that I mentioned. He argues, based on conflicting hadiths and the conflicting chronology that you can find in other hadiths, that actually this hadith is inauthentic. But there's a nuance here. Salahuddin thinks that the hadith is authentic in the sense that it actually does go all the way back to Aisha. However, he thinks that Aisha, in her old age, made a mistake about her own age, trying to look back decades before whenever she transmitted the hadith. And so, actually, even though it goes back to her, it's not a genuine historical memory. And again, he argues this by appealing to all of these, conflicting, as he sees it, conflicting established, historical evidences. Again, in my opinion, the considerations I mentioned at the outset, the problems with this sort of view are just going to apply equally in this case. Next we have Asma Afsaruddin, and she mentions a similar kind of chronological consideration to the sorts I was already mentioning above, a sort of conflicting chronology that implies that Aisha was older, but she also mentions, very interestingly, a rare variant of the marital age hadith, which does actually place Aisha's marital engagement later on at age 9, which would therefore imply an even later marital consummation. We also have Jonathan A.C. Brown, and although I don't think he's actually talked about this in print, he has talked about this hadith several times on podcasts and in social media and so on. And he argues that if one were to actually apply the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, which we'll get to subsequently, it would show that this hadith actually does go all the way back to Aisha herself. So in other words, in that sense, it is an authentic report. Next we have Yasmin Amin, and she appeals to some of this sort of chronological stuff as well, which I disagree with, but she also restates the ideas of Shanavas and develops those in an article or a conference paper that she wrote in 2016, and it was actually Yasmin who informed me about this hypothesis about the origins of the hadith, the Iraqi hypothesis. And up until that point, because I was at that point studying the hadith as part of my master's degree, and my provisional hypothesis, as I was working through the data, and I was then only looking at a smaller sample of the data, my provisional hypothesis was that the hadith actually went all the way back to Hisham's father, Urwa ibn az-Zubair, in Medina, in the late 7th century CE, in the context of the second fitna, the second Islamic civil war. So it was Yasmin who actually pointed out to me the absence of the hadith from key Medinan sources and the Iraqi pattern in the Isnads. And when I continued to research and sort of integrated all of the evidence, I discovered that this hypothesis held up. this hypothesis actually predicted or was generally consistent with all of the evidence. The idea that actually the hadith originated with Hisham ibn Urwa after he moved to Iraq. This hypothesis is by far the strongest one. It explains the most evidence. It's the simplest. And any other competing hypothesis ends up conflicting with, various points of evidence. Finally, we have Carolyn Bow, and although she doesn't go into much detail on this and doesn't sort of commit herself to a strong stance one way or the other, she does sort of summarize this sort of idea about the Iraqi origin, and she also points out that in the earliest layer of Islamic jurisprudence, this hadith does not appear. This hadith is not used, does not appear in the earliest fiqh. That instead, it only begins to be used in Islamic jurisprudence beginning with a Shafi'i who is operating at the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th century. Alright, next we have methods and debates, and this was just a survey of the major debates regarding whether or not, or to what extent, we can date hadith and how we can do that. And so I began by outlining some of the general problems with hadith that have been adduced by critical scholars in order to sort of generally cast doubt upon them, i.e. general reasons why we should doubt hadith, general reasons why any given hadith should be presumed to be unreliable until the contrary can be demonstrated. And if you want a bit more detail on that, I gave a sort of a fuller list of these kinds of considerations in a previous episode on the Impactful Scholar, and I only mentioned a couple of those anyway, to begin with, and then in this sort of chapter of my thesis, and then I move on to sort of exploring some of the dating methods that have been sort of proposed over the last, let's say half century or so of scholarship. So to begin with, we have dating by ascription type. And so this is essentially just using established background knowledge about the shift in focus in terms of legal authority and doctrinal authority across the 2nd and 3rd Islamic centuries. So essentially, initially people are mostly citing hadiths ascribed to followers and then companions and then the Prophet. And during the 8th century CE, people are mostly citing followers, and then there's a brief period where it seems like people are mostly citing companions at the end of the 8th century and the beginning of the 9th century, and then from then on people are overwhelmingly citing the Prophet. And this is what we find in legal works in terms of what's being cited. It's also what we find in hadith collections, generally speaking. The earliest ones mostly contain follower hadiths and to a lesser extent companion hadiths and some hadiths from the Prophet. And then over time the ratio of prophetical hadiths shoots up and up and up until the hadith collections of the 9th century, that all these major sort of entirely prophetical hadith collections obtain. And we also find that you'll have the same version of a hadith, but, in some versions it's ascribed to, let's say, a follower, and then to a companion, and then to the Prophet, which is also consistent with this sort of general process of the progressive retrojection of authority. And in this case, it's the progressive retrojection of specific hadiths back to earlier and earlier authorities. And there's a sort of a straightforward sort of polemical context that explains this. As people are arguing with each other and debating and so on, people are, on any given issue, invoking earlier and earlier authorities. And we also have general, on a general awareness in the classical sources about this phenomenon. It's explicitly identified, and so even the early Sunni hadith critics knew that stuff like this was occurring. It's just that, secular critical scholars think that this sort of thing was occurring, much more frequently than they realized, and it even applies to many, allegedly sahih hadiths. So if we just apply the criterion of dissimilarity, in light of all this background information, then when we find a hadith that's attributed, let's say, to the Prophet, and we have another hadith that's attributed to a companion, the prophetical version is likely later, the companion version is likely earlier. In other words, of the two, it's much more likely that the companion version was turned into the prophetical version rather than vice versa. Because for the people who end up transmitting and preserving the material, there's an incentive or a pressure to do that. They don't have an incentive or a pressure to turn the prophetical ascription into a companion ascription, because that would make it less valuable, less impactful, less authoritative. But you do have the reverse pressure or incentive. And so, it's more likely then that a prophetical version was created out of a companion version than vice versa. And so this is very straightforward. So when you have, let's say, especially the exact same hadith, but you have, one version is attributed all the way back to the prophet, another version is only attributed back to a companion, then the companion version has by far the stronger claim to being reflecting the original formulation of the hadith. And so when you have, multiple versions of the same hadith, the versions attributed to later authorities are probably earlier, and the versions attributed to earlier authorities are probably later. And so you can create a kind of relative chronology there. So this is a kind of relative dating that can be generated, though not necessarily an absolute dating. And the relevant considerations here are actually, again, discussed in that previous session. One of the 21 problems was to do with this. Next, we have arguments from silence. So this is very straightforward. The idea here is that there are all these debates occurring, early legal debates and so on, in the second and third Islamic centuries. And so when people are debating an issue and they fail to cite a hadith that was relevant to the issue, that's evidence that the hadith did not yet exist at the time, because if it had existed, they would have cited it. Now, there are important caveats in regards to this. This is not going to work for a case of interregional failure to cite early hadith. If someone in 8th century Iraq fails to cite a relevant hadith in 8th century, that was allegedly circulating in the 8th century in Medina, for example, that's not going to be telling, because early on the regions were fairly isolated in terms of hadith. There wasn't yet sort of regular or systematic traveling for knowledge and so on. And so it's entirely reasonable to think that someone in Iraq wouldn't be aware of, the hadith that was circulating over in Medina and vice versa. So an interregional failure to cite a relevant hadith is not going to be, good evidence against the existence of a hadith. Another problem is that people often fail to cite hadiths that are inexpedient, right? Polemicists and people in debates and so on and so forth in any context will often gloss over or ignore inexpedient evidence. This is just, a general and common phenomenon. And so, therefore, if someone is failing to cite a hadith that clashes with their position, then, again, we wouldn't expect them to cite that hadith, and their failure to cite the hadith would not indicate its non-existence. It would not be strong evidence indicating that the hadith at their time did not yet exist. So there are important caveats here. But the version that I argue for, the version of the argument from silence that I think is strong, is when you have a local failure to cite expedient hadiths from major local figures. So if allegedly some major early figure, let's say in Medina, allegedly was transmitting a hadith that was expedient to the interests and needs of, later Medinan collectors, we would expect them to cite it, especially if they frequently cite, numerous other transmissions from this same authority, and the material is directly in their interests. It, is useful for their doctrine, or it's directly relevant to their research interests, to the topic of their biographical collection, for example. So when you have this sort of failure to cite expedient material from major local authorities from whom people otherwise are frequently citing material, that's unexpected. The hypothesis that the hadith is circulating at that time, at that place with those people, and has that function, generates the reasonable expectation that these later people, these local collectors, would have cited it. And so their failure to cite it is actually evidence against its existence in that place at that time. And the more people who fail to cite it, the stronger the silence is. You could imagine a mistake here, a lapse of memory there, maybe someone just ran out of space. There are all kinds of, ways, things that we can think of. But when you have a collective, consistent failure to cite a hadith that's in everyone's interests and is from their major local cited authorities, and they otherwise, frequently cite things from these authorities, that's strong evidence. That is just unexpected on the view. And interestingly, you can even find some classical scholars who argue this way. So famously, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah argued in a very similar vein regarding a hadith that he was casting doubt upon. So to sort of summarize, absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, but absence of evidence is evidence of absence when the absent evidence is otherwise predicted by a hypothesis. Then that is evidence against the hypothesis. That's just straightforward. Next we have dating by polemical context and counter-traditions. So the idea here is just that, firstly, you can often find in legal debates that hadiths seem to be in dialogue with each other. Like, you'll have one hadith citing one authority, and then you'll have a counter-hadith citing the same authority, citing an early authority, and so on and so forth. And so you can actually put hadiths into a kind of dialectic. You can sort of sort them all out into a sort of back and forth sequence of argumentation, which of course would mean that, likely these hadiths are being created in response to each other. Some of these hadiths are subsequent to some of the other hadiths. And so, these are counter traditions, each one countering another and so on. And so that creates a relative chronology of the material. And in addition to that, you'll often find that subsequent hadiths, or to put it another way, when you have different versions of the same hadith and there's more elaborate and refined versions, those are more likely secondary. Because the general tendency is things get more sophisticated and sort of more elaborate, and detail accrues over time. Not always. There are some circumstances, there are exceptions, of course. In certain legal contexts, things will be abridged just to only bring out the key point. But in general, more elaborate usually means secondary, usually means it's later than the simpler version. So again, you have a sort of relative chronology. Next, we have the tradition historical source analysis. This is Motzki's method that he used in analyzing the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq. Essentially, the idea here is just that Motzki looked for these sort of criteria of reliability or criteria of authenticity in certain transmitters, and he basically tried to argue that we could show that certain transmitters are reliable, that they are not fabricating the material that they are disseminating. And so, he argued that signs of this kind of reliability are things like when transmitters sometimes say that they're not sure, or they will sometimes give their own opinions. And so he thought, if they're fabricating, then they wouldn't do that. And so therefore they weren't fabricating. This has been criticized very strongly by a number of scholars. Essentially, Motzki's argument is just completely unsound. There's no reason to think that fabricators were so sort of mechanical in the way that they were functioning, as if they always fabricated all the time, or they will all, obviously, it's possible that someone is fabricating sometimes and genuinely transmitting at other times. And in fact, this is what the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis shows. This is actually what Motzki himself shows at times. Some people would interpolate, for example, hadiths, and other times they genuinely transmit. So, and it's the same person doing it at different times. So, even his own research instantly, destroys this kind of wooden sort of mechanical notion of a fabricator. Additionally, there's this false dichotomy between, honestly transmitted authentic material and dishonestly transmitted inauthentic material. Of course, you can also have honestly transmitted inauthentic material, right? People can make mistakes, people can elaborate, people can engage in massive sort of speculation and inference and so on. All these pressures that can basically result in someone producing false material, but not intentionally or not mendaciously. So again, it just seems like this methodology is just straightforwardly unsound. Finally, we have dating by the common link. And this is the major method. This is the most famous method. This is the method that is the most widespread among secular scholars of hadith. The common link dating method originated with Yosef Schacht, whose work on this and whose theories on this inaugurated decades of debates about whether or not, we could identify genuine common links, or to what extent common links were genuine, whether or not there were false common links, or to what extent there were false common links, and so on and so forth. And there are many scholars who are involved in this debate, but for the sake of concision, I'm going to restrict this to Schacht, Michael Cook, Joinbol, and Harold Motzky. And here, Harold Motzky is a stand-in for the sort of school of thought that he embodied, which includes, notably, for example, Gregor Schuler and Andreas Gurka. If you want to see a fuller discussion of all of the other scholars involved and all the sort of intricate back and forth argumentation, then you can find that in the relevant chapter in my thesis. But for now, this will just be a sort of a simple summary of these most notable stances in the debate. So to begin with, let's clarify the concept of common link. What do I mean by a common link? So when you have a hadith, for example, you'll often have multiple versions of the same hadith. Maybe they're preserved in the same collection, maybe they're preserved across several different collections, but you'll have multiple versions of the same hadith, and each one will have their own isnad. And if you overlay the isnads, what you'll often find is that they all converge on a common transmitter. Usually it's someone operating at some point in the 8th century CE, and this common converged upon figure is often referred to as the common link. And so here it's a follower of the followers, in purple, the common link, and from the common link the isnads branch out to the extant collections, and then preceding the common link there's just a single strand all the way back to the Prophet in this case. And so Joseph Schacht argued that when you find this configuration, when you find this pattern, that the common link is the originator of the hadith, from whom it actually began to, organically branch out and to be disseminated and to spread, whereas the single strand preceding the common link is artificial. It is a retrojection by the common link. And the reason why Schacht argued this was because on his model, on independent grounds, he thought that most hadith came into being during the 2nd Islamic century, so approximately the 8th century CE. And so most common links just so happen to be operating in that exact time period. So they are sort of the prime candidates for being the creators, the actual specific creators of all of these hadiths. And so Schacht thought when you have a common link who is, operating at this time period, the generation of people like Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, for example, Schacht thought that hadiths could be traced back to these kinds of figures, all else being equal. Now, what you will often also find is at least one other strand that bypasses a common link and goes all the way back independently to the Prophet. And so Schacht thought that this was a false, parallel, pseudo-corroborating isnad that was essentially the product of what he called the spread of isnads, or the spreading of isnads. So the idea is just that there are various incentives and pressures for people to create alternative paths of transmission for material that they like. So it might be that people have their own preference of who should be in the isnad. So for example, there are regional preferences, there are familial or tribal preferences, there are sectarian preferences. Additionally, there's just the desire not to transmit from a contemporary, not to have, if you met the person whom another person is citing, you could just directly cite that person as well, even though you're actually hearing it from a contemporary. Or you just might want a shorter isnad, so you construct an isnad with, much longer-lived people in it. Or, for example, you may just want a rare isnad. Or, in general, you might just want corroborating isnads because some early Muslims, especially early rationalists, demanded multiple independent isnads in order to accept hadiths. So there's a whole regime of incentives and pressures that exist in the early period for people to create parallel, independent, seemingly independent isnads. And so in a case like this, Schacht would say that this, green isnad is a, secondary, false reascription of the same hadith. However, if the putative common link was someone earlier than the era in which most hadith emerged, on Schacht's view, if it was, for example, a follower, and certainly if it was seemingly a companion, then Schacht would be much more skeptical, and he would think that this sort of seeming common link would actually be the product of the spread of isnads. In this case, people are borrowing later on, but they're retaining the earlier part of the isnad in common in each successive borrowing because it contains people who were widely venerated, for example. All of the borrowers in question all accepted the earlier people in the isnad, and so you end up with a false common link emerging. And this sort of idea will become clearer when we then turn to Michael Cook. So Michael Cook essentially accepted and elaborated upon Schacht's concept of the spread of isnads and went into more detail enumerating all of the sort of pressures and incentives that I just outlined and explaining how it could actually work in practice. And so, for example, in this hypothetical, A creates the hadith and then B borrows it from A but cites A's source. This would be an instance in the classical terminology of tadlis. Then C borrows it and bypasses the transmission from B back to an earlier source, and then subsequently D borrows as well. And so you can end up with a pattern like this, where the follower of the followers here, the putative common link, is actually a false common link who has emerged through successive borrowings and retrojections in combination with the fact that often the earlier figures here are actually commonly accepted and venerated, and so they end up being retained through the successive borrowings. And so you end up with false common links emerging through a process like this. And one thing I should clarify is that this kind of process was accepted even by the proto-Sunni hadith critics as occurring sometimes on a spectacular scale. So there's a hadith that I'm studying where there are dozens of isnads, and every single one is rejected by the early hadith critics, by Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Yahya ibn Ma'in and al-Khatib al-Baghdadi and Ibn al-Jawzi. They reject all of them, every single isnad. There are, for example, more than a dozen isnads all converging on a putative common link, and every single one of them is rejected. And it's denied that that common link ever transmitted that hadith, for example, which is far more elaborate. That's a far more elaborate kind of spreading of isnads than anything that was ever advocated by Cook, for example. A much more dramatic example of that. So actually, everyone agrees that this sort of thing happened. The question is just how common did it happen, and amongst whom was it happening? So obviously, the proto-Sunni hadith critics want to say, they want to deny that this sort of thing was going on among their reliable transmitters or with sahih material that they regard to be sahih, whereas the secular scholars just don't make exceptions for these people and that material that received those labels. So Michael Cook then argues that, well, we can't really trust any common links, because any given common link, given all these widespread pressures and incentives for the emergence of effectively false common links, any given common link could be a false common link. So we actually can't use this method to date hadith. We can't trace a given hadith as far back as its common link. So Michael Cook actually argued that if you follow this point that Schacht outlined to its conclusion, then you actually end up eliminating Schacht's dating method, this dating method that Schacht outlined. Meanwhile, Gautier Yoimbol tried to defend Schacht's method by refining it and by developing stricter criteria by which to establish genuine transmission and genuine common links. So first of all, he introduced a new concept, which is a partial common link. So here in the blue, you see PCL, partial common link. So the idea is that these are sort of common links that appear subsequent to the major common link, so to speak. And so, in other words, partial common links. And so the idea here is that when you have a dense network of transmission, a dense network of corroboration, with multiple people transmitting to the partial common links and multiple partial common links transmitting to the higher up partial common links and multiple of them all transmitting from the common link, Yoimbol argued that it's very unlikely that this would result from the spread of isnads, from borrowings and false ascription and so on. And so what has to explain this is genuine transmission from the common link. And he argued that when you have 3 or more people transmitting directly from someone, then it's very unlikely that false ascription explains that. And so then you just duplicate that until you hit the point where, everything converges densely onto a single point. And then for him, by contrast, the single strand that precedes the common link, here in red, this is extremely suspect and, highly dubious, because he thought it was very unlikely that you just have one person receive from one person who receive from one person and so on. He thought that a single strands are inherently extremely unlikely. And so, therefore, if there's genuine transmission up to the common link, and then everything that precedes the common link is extremely suspect and, highly improbable, then, it follows from that the common link is the one who fabricated and disseminated the Hadith. The single strand that precedes them is just a back projection, and from them onwards we have genuine transmission. Meanwhile, over here we have in the green these secondary sort of strands over here. Yoimbal regarded these to be genuine instances of the spread of isnads, and he called these diving isnads, or just dives. And so these dives, because they're uncorroborated, 1 to 1 to 1 and so on, they're just these single strands. Again, he thought these were extremely unlikely, and therefore he rejected these as, genuine instances of the spread of isnads. And so this was Yoimbal's basic method, was by appealing to dense transmission and to networks of dense transmission. That was how he tried to verify common links, and conversely to expose, false retrojections and dives and the spread of isnads. However, it was pointed out, by Cook and others that, you could have a successive borrowing of 3. I mean, why couldn't that occur, right? I mean, even the Hadith critics thought that this sort of thing was going on. So actually, it seems like Yoimbal's criterion is sort of arbitrary. Why is it 3 plus? Why not a higher number? And so on. And so things become quite uncertain then. Like how many transmissions do you need before now it's like definitely not successive false ascription, for example? It's just not clear. So there's a way in which Yoimbal wasn't completely successful in really repelling Cook's skepticism in this regard. There is, however, an interesting consideration that even Yoimbal pointed out, although he never actually systematically implemented this in his own method. But there is an interesting pattern that you will observe when you look at hadiths, and that is that the ascriptions to a given partial common link are usually noticeably more similar to each other than they are to all other versions. And what you'll then end up with is these distinctive clusters around each respective partial common link, and more generally with the common link. In other words, there are distinctive sub-traditions and traditions that correlate with particular partial common links and common links. The partial common links vis-a-vis each other, and the common link vis-a-vis other common links who are associated with, other redactions or other iterations of similar material, for example. And so what explains this? Well, a simple explanation for this is that the distinctive, sub-tradition that is correlated with the partial common link embodies or reflects the particular paraphrase, the distinctive wording of that commonly cited source. And so something of their original wording and its provenance, the fact that it came from this source, has then been preserved in subsequent transmission, and that has occurred across the board, and thus you get these distinctive, sub-traditions associated with particular partial common links, and the same thing in turn for the common link. Something of the original, distinctive redaction of the common link. Maybe it's not the exact wording, but it's at least a distinctive sort of set of elements or something like that, has been preserved in common in all the transmissions from the common link, through the partial common links, and, vis-a-vis, the distinctive redactions of other common links, for example, on the same topic. And so this is the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. The Isnād-cum-Matn analysis identifies these correlations and postulates as the explanation for them basically a kind of genuine transmission. Now, this still often involves rewording, paraphrasing, adding elements, removing elements, adding in details, altering the isnad. All of that is quite common. So it's probably wrong to call this genuine transmission, or let's say it's wrong to call this accurate transmission. But there is something has been preserved in the course of transmission, so that the original sort of redaction of the partial common links and ultimately of the common link are still sort of showing through in the extant transmissions. And so this is the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. And this is most famously associated with Harold Motzki, with Gregor Schuler, with Andreas Gurka, and others. Now, as it happens, if we sort of track the variation that's occurring here, what we find is that there's minimal variation from the partial common link to the common links, but there's much greater variation from the common link to the partial common links. And if we measure that variation and we then compare this, earlier on there's larger variation, later on there's lesser variation. If we then compare this to the rise of written transmission and rigorous, transmission practices, we find that there's a match, that the uptick in reliability from the partial common links to their students broadly correlates with the rise of written transmission in Hadith. And so I argue that in general, the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis as a postulate for, as an explanation being posited for this pattern of evidence is actually independently corroborated by this established background knowledge on the increasing rise of writing in Hadith. And so we see this echoed in the actual results of Isnād-cum-Matn analyses. And so that's a further reason to think that what we have here in general is a kind of genuine transmission, at least from the common link onwards, instead of, for example, the spread of isnads or dives or whatever. But this also allows us to detect dives and the spread of isnads. So, for example, in this instance, we see here that we have a distinctive wording associated with a particular partial common link, which is this sub-tradition indicated in blue, and there's a very particular set of elements, a particular set of wordings that embody the paraphrase, the distinctive wording of a specific partial common link within the broader tradition. And then we have over here, suspiciously, we have that exact distinctive sort of wording or elemental sequence and so on. A distinctive redaction of this partial common link shows up with a completely independent isnad, allegedly, totally bypassing this. And that's extremely suspicious. That's just what it would look like if someone pinched this version and just gave it an independent isnad. It's very unlikely that the distinctive redaction over here, that's an organic outgrowth of this overall tradition through this particular person's rewording, would then just show up completely independently from a completely different sort of evolution. It's very unlikely. And so probably what's going on here is someone has borrowed this version from over here, or it's been, totally contaminated. And when you have, additionally, multiple ascriptions to a common link, but each of all the ascriptions are not more similar to each other, they're all actually more similar to the ascriptions to other common links than they are to each other, that's a sign that we have a false common link. What explains that is different people have borrowed different versions from other sources and have ascribed them to this common source, but they've done so, independently of each other, without colluding with each other, and so therefore the versions don't match. There is no common distinctive version correlating with this commonly cited source, because actually all the versions have been variously taken from other sources and reascribed to this common respected source, for example. But again, it's just produced a totally disparate, quote-unquote tradition, as it were. And so that's a way to detect a false common link. So using Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, we can not only detect genuine transmission, so to speak, but we can also detect false transmission. Now, in this respect, I somewhat depart from Motzki and others because they were sometimes idiosyncratic in applying the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, and they weren't always applying this logic consistently. And so there are instances where they overlook these kinds of patterns, where there's clearly borrowings or close relationships that are then just sort of overlooked. For example, additionally, in the previous literature, there isn't really this kind of rigorous defense of the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis and showing the sort of corroborating evidence for it in any kind of sort of systematic way. And so that's sort of my contribution here, is to try and outline a more sort of systematic and robust and falsifiable Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. There is actually another version of the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis that involves a slightly different kind of reasoning, and I'm very critical of that, at least applied to the early period. So if you want to find out about that, I cover that in detail in my thesis. But for now, I think this will suffice to give us a sense for the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. And so it is this methodology that I will then apply to the Hadith of Aisha's marital age. One final consideration and one final debate in all of this is, what is the role of the common link? Is the common link genuinely transmitting what they receive from their cited source, or is the common link essentially just fabricating the hadith, or is it somewhere in between? And this has been a source of great debate in scholarship over the last few decades. Sometimes it can be shown that the common links, are actually genuinely transmitting earlier material. Sometimes it can be shown that they're actually accurately citing their cited source, because you'll then discover actually the source, this cited source, is the real common link. For example, when Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, who often appears as a common link, and Hisham ibn Urwa, who also often appears as a common link, both cite in common their own versions from a further common source, which is Urwa. And when they both cite, the same, essentially the same basic tradition from Urwa, just their own sort of versions, then it looks like, well, actually, in those instances, they are genuinely transmitting, from an earlier source. But then there are other times when we often find that they alter what they receive. They may even, not infrequently, people will alter isnads. There are lots of instances of that occurring. And so, at minimum, everyone agrees that the common links are changing what they receive. They are paraphrasing, and not just, arwaya bil ma'na. No. People are altering the content. They are changing details. They're adding elements. They are altering the isnads. This is quite common. However, in some instances they are genuinely transmitting material from a cited source. But in general, we have reason to be skeptical, especially given the chronology. There's a general acceptance, a general agreement in secular critical scholarship that the isnad has its roots in the second fitna, but it takes decades after that to become generalized. And so it's only with the generation of, for example, Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, operating in the early to mid 8th century CE, that the isnad becomes widespread. And so that means that when they were young and putatively receiving their material, it wasn't yet customary to cite sources and to document sources. That emerges subsequently. And so, when they are older, and when they are transmitting to their students, at that point, it's now customary to cite sources and so on. And so what that means is that even if the common links did genuinely hear a lot of material from earlier sources, by the time it comes to them to cite those sources in transmitting to their students, decades have passed, and they weren't keeping close track, because when they were learning material, it wasn't yet customary to note sources. So what that means is that we do have reason to doubt that they could even remember, in many cases, from where they had received any given datum. And that's even assuming that they thought that they really had to remember exactly from whom they had received something, rather than just citing, for example, an ideal source or what they would regard to be a probable source, and so on and so forth. So just given the chronology of isnads, there is reason to doubt in general, and so these things have to be taken on a case-by-case basis. A given common link could be genuinely transmitting from their cited source, or they could not be. And so, it just depends on the given case. And in general, I think there's reason for caution. There's reason for doubt. This brings us to the practical heart of my dissertation, which is the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis of the marital age hadith. And so for this, I collated every single version of the hadith that I could find. So I checked every database, every concordance, every encyclopedia of hadith, and I collected every single version that I could find, and I put them all in a diagram together, and I systematically compared all of the versions, and I reconstructed, where possible, every single partial common link redaction wherever the patterns I mentioned held up, and applying sort of standard, textual critical, and historical reasoning, sort of criterion of dissimilarity, more difficult wordings are more likely to be rendered into easier to understand wordings rather than vice versa, and so on and so forth. And I reconstructed the underlying redactions of every single partial common link, and then moving backwards in time to every single common link where that was possible. And I also identified wherever the patterns did not hold up, or wherever in fact there was signs of multiple false ascriptions of different distinctive versions from other sub-traditions that were then falsely ascribed to a common source. So false common links, or Yoinbol used the term spiders, so these sort of false common links or spiders. And I also identified in the process every single instance of variation, every single instance of interpolation, raising, contamination, etc. that occurred in the transmission from the common links to the partial common links, and from the partial common links to the extant collections. Every single variant, every single added or omitted word or particle, every single alteration to the isnad, every single borrowing from one sub-tradition to another, every single one that I could find, I document them all. So here we have the actual diagram that I created, and if I zoom in, maybe it'll be a bit clearer. So here we have, for example, the common link Hisham ibn Urwa, and then we have a vast web of transmission from him to all of these various partial common links, and also single strand transmissions that all emanate from Hisham. And then we also have some other, for example, common links here. We've got Muhammad ibn Amr. And you can immediately see at a glance the distinctive sort of traditions and sub-traditions within the overall corpus of material. So for example, if you look at the transmissions from the partial common link Ahmad ibn Abd al-Jabbar, you'll immediately see, for example, that they all begin with Lama matat Khadija. So they have this keyword matat. Now if we instead turn to the transmissions from another partial common link, Muhammad ibn Bishr, what we instead find at the beginning is Lamma halakat Khadija. And if we then turn further to another partial common link, Sa'id ibn Yahya, we find yet another distinctive wording in the transmissions from him, which is Lamma tuwuffiyat Khadija. Now all of these are saying the same thing. Matat, halakat, tuwuffiyat. It all just means she died. All of these are saying when Khadija died. But each of them is using a different word, and the pattern is consistent. All of the transmissions from one partial common link have one word, all the transmissions from another have another, and all the others from another in turn. And if you go through all of these transmissions, you'll find many examples like this where there is a distinctive sub-tradition, and another distinctive sub-tradition, and another distinctive sub-tradition. We have respective distinctive sub-traditions associated with each partial common link, and in turn, all of them as a whole embody a common tradition vis-a-vis all the rest. The broad set of elements that they share in common, even though there's been a lot of sort of abridgments going on here because it's such a long hadith, so some people would sort of cut out the sections they were interested in, which is not uncommon for extremely long hadiths that I found. But still, overall, you will find, despite differences between the different sub-traditions, they embody a common, distinctive, overall tradition from the common link. And we can find that in several cases across this material, where several of these common links are actually associated with distinctive traditions. For another example, there is a distinctive tradition associated with Al-A'mash, for example, even though there's, apart from this one densely corroborated partial common link, there are only these sort of two sort of single strands reaching back to him, but most of them do embody, despite some interpolation across the material, this distinctive sequence of Aisha was married, i.e. engaged to be married, at age 9. So remember, the common version of the hadith is that she was married, i.e. engaged to be married, at age 6 or 7, and consummated at 9. But in this distinctive tradition from Al-A'mash, instead she is engaged to be married at age 9, not consummated at age 9. And then it usually is also accompanied with this distinctive element of, and then the Prophet died when she was a girl of 18 years. And this distinctive combination recurs in all the ascriptions to Al-A'mash. So again, we have a distinctive overall tradition associated with the common source. And, there are other examples like this as well. So this is just to quickly illustrate, the kind of sort of patterns that we're looking for. And so I went through and I did this for every single transmission. I noted when there are distinctive sub-traditions associated with partial common links and distinctive traditions associated with the common link. And I also noted when that is absent. So for example, here we have all of these different transmissions, which reduce to 4 different strands, all reaching back to Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri. But if one studies the texts of these different ascriptions to az-Zuhri carefully, and one compares them to other versions, it immediately becomes clear that there is no distinctive tradition here. Each of these is in key respects much more similar to other versions than they are to each other. They do not embody a common tradition. So for example, even though this transmission from Ibn Sa'ad contains an element about the Prophet's death, and the transmission from Abd al-Razzaq contains an element from the Prophet's death, if you actually look closely, the version cited by Abd al-Razzaq is actually the distinctive wording that one finds in the hadith of Abu Muawiyah from Al-A'mash. That's his distinctive wording. Whereas the wording of this element that's found in this other version from Ibn Sa'ad, allegedly traced back to az-Zuhri, the wording of this version of the death element is actually the same as the distinctive wording that one finds in the tradition of Isra'il ibn Yunus. So even these superficially similar elements turn out to be from different sub-traditions from across the corpus. So there is no actual cohesion here. And they also differ on basic points to do with like her age, for example, Aisha's age. They also differ fundamentally in the ascription. Is it from az-Zuhri himself? Is it az-Zuhri citing Urwa? Is it az-Zuhri, so this is a clear instance where az-Zuhri is a spider. Az-Zuhri is a false common link. There is no distinctive tradition associated with him in contrast to the others that we examined. So by applying this method consistently, by analyzing all of the material, these are the earliest common links whose redactions I was able to reconstruct. Firstly, Al-A'mash, a famous Kufan scholar who died between 764 and 766. He can be tentatively attributed this version of the hadith. He cites Ibrahim from Al-Aswad, from Aisha, who said, "The Messenger of God married her when she was a girl of 9 years, and he died when she was a girl of 18 years. I was also able to reconstruct the redaction, in fact 4 different redactions, disseminated by Hisham ibn Urwa, who was a major Medinan scholar who moved to Iraq, and he died between 763 and 765. Probably the original version of the hadith that he articulated was this. We don't know exactly what he said in terms of citing his father, because that wording in the first person is not actually recorded from him. So I'm just speculating that he said, Qala Abi. We don't actually know what the wording was. It's not attested. But in any case, we know that he claimed to receive from his father the information that the Messenger of God married Aisha when she was a girl of 6 years or 7, and he consummated the marriage with her when she was a girl of 9 years. Hisham also disseminated a version in which he added an element concerning how long Aisha and the Prophet lived together. He also transmitted a version in the form of a letter that was allegedly written by his father to Abdul Malik. And finally, he also disseminated a much more elaborate version, now articulated as Aisha's own autobiographical recollection about the day of her marital consummation and all the details and the context for that. The hijrah, and she fell ill, and her hair became short, and her inner thoughts on the day of the consummation, and the marital preparation, and so on. Another redaction of this hadith can be attributed to the common link Ismail ibn Abi Khalid, who was a Kufan scholar who died between 763 and 764. His version of the hadith was an elaborate fada'il. His version of the hadith was a fada'il report, so a list of the merits or praises or positive attributes of Aisha, and included therein is the marital age elements. That Aisha was married at age 7 and consummated in marriage at age 9. Finally, the earliest common link to whom I was able to reconstruct a redaction, i.e. for whom there existed a distinctive overall tradition embodied in the material transmitted from them or on their authority, was Muhammad ibn Amr, who was Medinan, and he also, like Hisham, moved to Iraq, and he died between 761 and 763. His version of the hadith was an extremely elaborate narrative that begins with the death of Khadija and the Prophet's search for new wives and the trials and tribulations that occurred therein, with Abu Bakr's having to go and nullify his previous marital arrangements for Aisha, and the sending of an emissary to consult the father of Sauda. And then the final section is a version of the elaborate autobiographical narrative that we found above with Hisham. That final fourth redaction that Hisham disseminated, we find basically the same narrative with the same elements and a lot of the same distinctive wordings appearing here in the end of this narrative in the redaction of Muhammad ibn Amr. And actually, just using sort of standard textual critical principles and building a stemma, it turns out that this version, this redaction, this version of this material that Muhammad ibn Amr disseminated fits in as a sub-branch of the transmissions of the same material from Hisham, which is to say, it looks exactly like Muhammad ibn Amr took his material from Hisham, and thus his material fits in as an outgrowth of the, that material that's emanating from Hisham. This is also consistent with the fact that if you look carefully at this hadith, you'll find that it clearly is comprised of originally discrete blocks of material where there are sharp shifts in the narrator. So initially, it's a narrative about Khawla and about Abu Bakr going and visiting someone to, nullify Aisha's marriage. But then it shifts, and now Aisha is the narrator, and there's this whole new narrative. And you can sort of see very clearly the sort of stitch marks, as it were, between the different narratives that have been joined together. So the hadith manifestly just on narrative grounds looks like it's been stitched together from different parts, and then on stemmatic grounds and sort of textual critical grounds, it seems very likely that actually Muhammad ibn Amr just directly took his version, the ending here, this elaborate, autobiographical narrative from Aisha, from the tradition of his contemporary in Iraq, Hisham ibn Urwa. So just to reiterate, the earliest common links, the earliest commonly cited sources back to whom distinctive redactions of this material, the marital age hadith, can be attributed, the earliest common links are Al-A'mash, Hisham ibn Urwa, Ismail ibn Abi Khalid, and Muhammad ibn Amr. I was not able to trace this material back to any earlier figure. There are no distinctive underlying redactions that can be recovered for figures like Abu Ishaq as-Sabi'i, Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri, Urwa ibn az-Zubair, or even Aisha. In fact, one of the things that I found repeatedly in this reconstruction was that in the original redactions of the hadiths under consideration, Aisha was not cited as the source. Very frequently, Aisha's being cited as the source of the hadith is a product of raising. It is a secondary development in the material. Next, I took the results of this Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. I took all of these reconstructed, earliest versions of the Aisha hadith, and I subjected them to a further set of analyses. So to begin with, I compared their ascription types, and of course immediately the version of Al-A'mash, which is ascribed explicitly all the way back to Aisha herself, looks secondary compared to, for example, the earliest formulation of Hisham's hadith, which was actually not ascribed explicitly all the way back to Aisha herself, but was instead just the statement of his father, a statement attributed to his father, Urwa. And so immediately Hisham's looks more archaic than Al-A'mash's. Al-A'mash's looks secondary compared to Hisham's version. Then I subjected all of the reconstructed redactions to form criticism. And a very interesting conclusion emerged from this. There are numerous ways in which the information contained in all of these hadiths could be expressed. There are lots of different sort of grammatical structures. There are lots of different sort of verbs that could be used. There are lots of different, many different ways that this information could be expressed. But what we actually find again and again in the earliest redactions of the material is the same structures. Usually we find the same sequence, and even when the full sequence isn't there, the wordings of those without the full sequence will still be the same as those that are found in the full sequence. And usually the same structures are being used throughout, and the same verbs keep appearing, and even where there is variation with the verbs, again, the overall structure is the same, the sequence is the same. And this is the case across all of the earliest reconstructible versions of the hadith. There's a consistent underlying formula. The same structures appear over and over. This is consistent with all of the material originating from a single hadith. In other words, it doesn't look like what we have here is multiple different independent recollections of the same event that have been expressed in numerous different original wordings. What it actually looks like, given the recurrence of the same structures over and over, is that all the material must go back to a series of recent common ancestors that all originate from a single original redaction, an hadith underlying all of the material. And then what's even more interesting is if we apply just a standard textual critical principle, which is which one of the readings more likely gave rise to the other, there is a clear answer here. There is one version, and only one version of this hadith. In all versions, there is one version that can explain all the others, using just the simple, standard, well-known sort of processes of alteration in the course of transmission, whether it's through specification or elaboration or conflation. There is one version that could naturally, organically give rise to all other versions in a way that is not true in reverse. And that is the version of Hisham ibn Urwa. His version, his original formulation, which is that Aisha was married when she was a girl of 6 or 7 and consummated in marriage when she was a girl of 9. That version can explain the rise of all the others. It can explain the rise of the versions that say that Aisha was married at 6 and consummated at 9. Because there, the vague 6 or 7 has been specified into just saying 6. And actually Hisham himself did this at certain points in time. So sometimes he would just transmit to his students 6. And it also explains the rise of all the versions that say married at 7 and consummated at 9. Again, the same thing has happened, just instead of 6 being specified, 7 has been specified. This version, Hisham's version, can also explain the rise of the versions that say that Aisha was married at 9. Because either two elements have just been conflated, so the marital element and the consummation element have just been conflated into one through error, for example, and so it's just become Aisha was married at 9, or there's a misreading of the rasm, because the Arabic word for 7 and the Arabic word for 9, when they are written without dots and dashes, so in other words, if they were written in sort of rudimentary handwriting, look identical. They have the same rasm, they have the same underlying consonantal skeleton. The only versions that Hisham's doesn't effortlessly explain are those that say that Aisha was married at age 10 or consummated in marriage at age 10. But these are ultra rare and generally attested late, and additionally, they contain the same distinctive wordings and formulas as all the rest. When the isnads are also taken into consideration, this has an interesting implication. All versions of this hadith clearly derive from a single hadith, but most of the isnads do not depict this. They don't converge on a single common source. Most of the isnads depict the different versions of their hadiths as the independent recollections and independent statements of completely different people about Aisha. So in a sense, most of these isnads have to be false. Most of these isnads are not disclosing the common source that clearly, inferably, on the basis of the texts, underlies all of these versions. All of them derive from a common source, but a common source is not acknowledged in the earliest versions of all of these hadiths. In addition to form criticism, I also examined geography, and for example, geography reflected in the isnads. And here, something interesting emerged. All of the earliest common links are Iraqi. So for example, there's Abu Awana al-Wadah, who I haven't actually touched upon yet, but who is a relatively early common link, and he was from Wasit and he moved to Basra, but most of his authorities are actually Kufan, and he cites a Kufan source. Isra'il ibn Yunus was Kufan, and he cites a Kufan source. Sulaiman al-Amash was Kufan, and he also cites a Kufan single strand. Ismail ibn Abi Khalid was Kufan, and even Hisham ibn Urwa and Muhammad ibn Amr, who at first glance seemed to be Medinan. Well, as it turns out, Muhammad ibn Amr moved to Iraq at the end of his life, and every single one of his students, every single person who transmitted this hadith from him was Iraqi, especially Kufan. And the same goes for Hisham ibn Urwa. Every single one of Hisham ibn Urwa's students who transmit this hadith from him are Iraqi, especially Kufan, with 4 alleged examples. But 2 of them are Medinans who moved to Iraq. So immediately the pattern seems to cohere. And then there are 2 others. One is just a totally gharib hadith. It's this sort of aberrant hadith. It has elaborations in the Matn, so it looks like a secondary construction. So this is just consistent with being a dive by a later transmitter. And actually, even the traditional scholarship rejects the transmitters in this hadith as being weak and rejected and as fabricators and so on and so forth. But even without that, I mean, the Matn looks secondary. So it just so happens that this one transmission, seemingly from a Medinan from Hisham, has an overly elaborate Matn that is consistent with being a dive. And then the other transmitter who seems to break the pattern is Ma'mar ibn Rashid. But as it turns out, Ma'mar was itinerant and he travelled around a lot. So already that places a question mark on where he could have actually picked it up. But, reasonably, if all else were equal, we would just assume that he received it from Hisham. Any hadith he transmits from Hisham, we would naturally assume he received it from Hisham when they met in Medina, before Hisham moved to Iraq. But then the other problem is that the only version that can actually be positively attributed to Ma'mar using the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis turns out to be an extremely unusual and deviant version that is totally uncorroborated by any other transmission from Hisham, which is consistent with Ma'mar's having received the hadith indirectly in a garbled form from Hisham. So it just so happens the one alleged transmission that would seem to anchor Hisham's transmission of this hadith to Medina, it turns out the only version that we can positively attribute to him is consistent with being some sort of indirect transmission. Now, of course, the version that is transmitted from Ma'mar by Abd al-Razzaq is more standard looking. But it turns out that Abd al-Razzaq specifically interpolated his version. The version of Abd al-Razzaq contains, again, a unique set of elements that are not found in any other transmission of the numerous transmissions of this hadith from Hisham ibn Urwa. This is consistent with his having interpolated the hadith. He has combined elements from different hadiths that were transmitted by Hisham and then transmitted from Hisham to other masters of Abd al-Razzaq. And in addition to that, Abd al-Razzaq even changed the isnad. There's clear evidence that he raised the isnad as well. But again, if you actually apply Isnād-cum-Matn analysis and you compare Abd al-Razzaq's transmission from Ma'mar to the only other transmission we have from Ma'mar, what can actually be traced back to him is this unusual, aberrant formulation that is completely uncorroborated by the other versions. So either we're stuck with Abd al-Razzaq, who clearly interpolated his version, his ascription to Ma'mar, or we actually use corroboration to reach Ma'mar, in which case we end up with an aberrant version that's uncorroborated. So again, either we can't reach back to Ma'mar, or we reach back to Ma'mar and what we can reach back to him with is consistent with some sort of indirect and garbled transmission. And this is an excruciating coincidence. The only alleged indicators are people who moved to Iraq as well, and an elaborate secondary-looking matn that looks like a dive, and a garbled transmission from Ma'mar. So there's a simple explanation here. Hisham transmitted this hadith after he moved to Iraq, and then there are one or two instances of borrowing and suppression and indirect transmission that then resulted in a patina of pseudo-Medinan transmission. But again, all problematic. So immediately, just looking at the isnads, we have this overwhelming Iraqi tendency. We have this seeming Iraqi bottleneck with these one or two alleged exceptions being problematic, and then we turn to arguments from silence. And we look at the earliest Medinan collections. Because as it turns out, we have the Muwatta of Malik, we have the Mudawwana of Sahnun, and the whole rest of the early Maliki legal tradition, for example, which is all based on Medinan material. And we also have the Kitab al-Maghazi of Ibn Ishaq, and the Hadith of Aisha's marital age is not found anywhere in the early Maliki legal tradition or in the work of Ibn Ishaq. It also seems to be absent from the Kitab al-Maghazi of Musa ibn Uqba. Now remember, all of these early Medinan collections are full of transmissions from Hisham ibn Urwa, Muhammad ibn Amr, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, Urwa, and Aisha. And all of these collections would gain from including this hadith. It contains potential legal utility for the Malikis, who were engaging in fierce legal debates relating to the marriage of minors. And it was of biographical interest because it was a report of the marriage of the Prophet to his favorite wife. So it just seems completely inexplicable. One would just have to posit a whole series of ad hoc auxiliary hypotheses and coincidences to explain the consistent absence in all early Medinan sources, the consistent failure of all early Medinan sources to cite this hadith, which was allegedly transmitted from the leading scholars of Medina, generation after generation, and then suddenly totally absent from all the earliest Medinan sources. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just totally implausible. If the hadith was circulating among the greatest figures in Medina, and if the hadith was of use to both the legal tradition and to the early biographers, and if the Medinan legal tradition and the early biographers were constantly citing transmissions from all of these major authorities, it's just reasonable to expect that they would cite this hadith. Their consistent failure to cite the hadith is inconsistent. It's just straightforwardly unexpected on the hypothesis that the hadith was circulating in Medina from Urwa, from Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, from Hisham ibn Urwa. And as it happens, we have reports about how Malik refused to transmit hadiths from Hisham that Hisham transmitted after he left Medina. So in other words, Malik would transmit the hadiths that Hisham transmitted before he left Medina, but he refused to transmit what he only started to transmit when he moved to Iraq. And as it happens, Malik does not transmit this hadith anywhere from Hisham ibn Urwa, which is consistent with this hadith being one of Hisham's Iraqi transmissions. A final point here in regards to arguments from silence concerns the Iraqi transmissions, or more precisely the Kufan transmissions, because both Isra'il ibn Yunus and Al-A'mash cite Kufan single strands for their versions of the hadith. Al-A'mash cites Ibrahim al-Nakha'i from Al-Aswad from Aisha, and Isra'il cites Abu Ishaq from Abu Ubaidah. Now, as it happens, the early Kufan legal tradition, the proto-Hanafi legal tradition of Kufa, was absolutely obsessed with the disciples of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, which included his son, Abu Ubaidah, and with Ibrahim al-Nakha'i. And the early Kufan legal tradition and the proto-Hanafi tradition never cites this hadith. They never cite this hadith. If there were versions of this hadith that were circulating among the companions and among the followers, among these early major figures in Kufa, it is reasonable to expect that this material would have been inherited by the early Kufan legal tradition that was obsessed with material from precisely those figures. Now, of course, there is one alleged exception. The extant Kitab al-Asl of Ash-Shibani does reference the marital age hadith. There are two problems here. Firstly, this is probably an interpolation, or the work in general is probably a later reworking. And there are good indications that that is the case, given the complete absence of this reference in the entire subsequent Hanafi tradition for centuries. You would think if one of the founders of the tradition in a major foundational work had actually made this reference, you would expect it to show up. But actually, the early Hanafi legal tradition is completely silent, which is consistent with this being an interpolation. But even if this is actually not an interpolation, even if we grant for the sake of argument that for some reason Ash-Shaybani cited this hadith for a legal doctrine and then the entire subsequent Hanafi tradition forgot about it for a couple of centuries, even if we grant that, there's a problem. The version of the hadith, the text of the hadith that Ash-Shaybani allegedly cited in the Kitab al-Asl is not the version attributed to Abu Ubaidah. It's not the version attributed to Ibrahim. The version that he cites is the version from Hisham ibn Urwa. So even if the ascription to Ash-Shaybani is genuine, we still have an unexpected silence. So what all of this means is, all of the ascriptions back to early major Medinan authorities are in doubt. It looks like Hisham ibn Urwa did not transmit this hadith when he was in Medina. He only started transmitting it after he moved to Iraq. And even the Kufan common links, like Israel ibn Yunus and Al-A'mash, seem to be falsely citing their local sources as well. So just to quickly summarize, all of the earliest common links are Kufan, or moved to Kufa, or moved to Iraq but mostly transmitted to Kufans and in Kufa. The hadith cannot be traced back to their Kufan and Medinan sources. Hisham's version is the most widespread out of all versions, and it also uniquely looks like the hadith. There's a simple explanation for all of this evidence. Hisham created the hadith. The hadith is Hisham's creation. In other words, the marital age hadith cannot be traced back to Medina in the 7th or 8th centuries CE. It cannot be traced back any earlier than Hisham and his contemporaries in Iraq, i.e., it does not go back to the preceding Iraqi generations either. All versions derive from an hadith. Hisham's version was the most widespread of all, and Hisham's version uniquely looks like the hadith behind all of the rest. So again, what actually explains all of this, and what is the simplest explanation for all of this, is that Hisham created this hadith after he moved from Medina to Iraq. Now, as it happens, if we then conduct a historical critical analysis, if we then look at the context of Hisham in Iraq in the early Abbasid period, in the mid to late 8th century CE, what we discover immediately is that the hadith perfectly matches Hisham's specific conditions and his specific context. So in other words, we have a good match between the content of the hadith and its early use on the one hand, and Hisham's context in Iraq on the other. To begin with, there are some interesting reports about how Hisham specifically became unreliable when he moved to Iraq. And there are several different reports about this, variously saying that he transmitted things from his father, that he did not hear from his father when he moved to Iraq. My analysis does not rely on those sorts of reports, since I think the evidence is clear regardless, but it is interesting that even in the traditional material, even in the traditional assessments, there are some reports that are broadly consistent with this, at least broadly. Now, they presumably don't have in mind something as extreme as I'm proposing, which is that Hisham fully created the hadith. But it is at least interesting that there is a general recognition in early Sunni hadith scholarship that Hisham became unreliable, specifically when he moved to Iraq, that he began to transmit things from his father that he had not heard from his father. Moving on then from those reports and looking at Hisham's context in Iraq at that time, can we find a reason why this was created? And in order to answer this question, I looked for the earliest use of this hadith. What was the hadith first used for? And I expected, and many people expect, that it was for a legal purpose. But actually, if you look at the evidence, that is not the earliest documented or solidly identifiable use for the hadith. The earliest legal use for the hadith that we're able to securely identify is by a Shafi'i who died in 820 CE. But decades before a Shafi'i, we find the marital age hadith being used, or maybe I should say being incorporated, into Fada'il material, into Fada'il reports by, for example, Abu Awana al-Wadah, who died in 792, and Ismail ibn Abi Khalid, who died between 763 and 764. Both of these Kufan common links disseminated hadiths enumerating Aisha's virtues, which incorporate the distinctive sequence from Hisham ibn Urwa, this marital age element and the marital consummation element. And they integrate these elements into a broader list of Aisha's various virtues in order to show that she was the Prophet's favorite wife and that she was uniquely blessed amongst women. And the context here is very straightforward. This was anti-Shi'i or counter-Shi'i propaganda. This was a proto-Sunni effort to make Aisha look good and to defend her, and thus by extension to defend the proto-Sunni movement, for whom Aisha and her father Abu Bakr were symbolic, were representative, against the Shia and against the criticisms of the Shia, the criticisms of Abu Bakr, the criticisms of Aisha. Because, as it happens, Kufa was the center of Shi'ism at this time. So in other words, Hisham moved to the center of Shi'ism, where there were these intense polemical and sectarian debates occurring around Aisha, and there's a pre-existing pool of Fada'il material circulating in Kufa about Aisha, and then he produced this hadith, and then immediately it was incorporated into that pre-existing pool of Fada'il material about Aisha. So there's no question about this. This is totally unequivocal, and this was already pointed out by Denise Spellberg decades ago. This hadith was immediately seen and understood and used as ammunition in proto-Sunni polemics evidently directed against the Shia. From the get-go, this hadith was perceived to be a fadila. It was perceived to be a virtue, something that bolstered Aisha, something that made her look good. And it's quite obvious how it was seen that way. If Aisha was married at a young age, that exemplifies and bolsters her being a virgin at the time of her marriage. And remember, one of Aisha's most distinctive attributes, one of the most cited factors for her being the Prophet's favorite wife, was that she was the Prophet's only virgin wife. And if this hadith was immediately seen in Hisham's context by his contemporaries as having this function, it's completely reasonable to think that Hisham himself would have seen the same potential function, that he would have perceived the same potential utility for the material. So this immediately creates a motive. There is a clear motive here for Hisham's creating of this hadith. It's to defend his kinswoman, his family member, and also his venerated ideological forebear, as a proto-Sunni, from the criticisms of the sect that was dominant in the very place where he moved. So to put it simply, it looks like Hisham, when he moved to this new environment, was suddenly exposed to this intense polemical environment and produced some ammunition to defend Aisha against the criticisms that were popular there. Now, of course, this raises a question. Why specifically 6 or 7, and why specifically 9? Why the specific content? Sure, we have a general reason for the creation of a hadith depicting Aisha as having been married at a young age, but why the specific choice of ages for the marital engagement, and why the gap, and why the specific choice of age 9 for the marital consummation? So there's no way to know for sure, but there are some interesting considerations here. First of all, we can trace back to Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri a relative chronology for Aisha's marriage. Provisionally, this statement about Aisha's marriage can be traced back to Ibn Shihab az-Zuhri. The Messenger of God married Aisha bint Abi Bakr during Shawwal in the 10th year of the prophethood, 3 years before the Hijrah, and he arranged her marriage feast in Medina during Shawwal at the beginning of 8 months after his emigration to Medina. Or there's a variant here, possibly 18 months. The wording is a bit unclear. There are conflicting transmissions from Ibn Shihab Zuhri. So in other words, it seems like before Hisham ibn Urwa, in Medina, there was already an established idea, an established chronology relating to Aisha's marriage. There seems to have been an idea that there was some kind of 3-year gap between Aisha's marital engagement and her marital consummation. But as we just saw, there's some uncertainty over exactly how long this gap was. So if there was some kind of idea like this floating around, then it makes sense why Hisham has this division. And this also tells us, given that there's some uncertainty around exactly how long this gap was, why there's this vague oscillation between 6 and 7. Because Hisham started off with the age 9. And then he applied this fuzzy gap of 3 years or so, which then automatically generated a vague 6 or 7. So in other words, if you start by positing age 9 as the age of marital consummation, and then you take in mind some kind of gap, but there's some uncertainty about exactly how long that gap is, you end up with, for example, a vague 6 or 7. So this explains the vague 6 or 7. It's automatically generated by starting with age 9 and then just applying this chronology, this seemingly pre-existing chronology, when also taking into account the fact that the chronology is a little bit fuzzy. So we seem to have an explanation for why there's a gap in Hisham's hadith between the marital engagement and the marital consummation. And we also seem to have an explanation for why it's this sort of fuzzy 6 or 7. But the question remains, why 9? Why is Hisham positing 9 as the age of Aisha's marital consummation? And here, there is no clear answer, but there are several interesting possibilities that we can find when we look at his context. So to begin with, there is evidence that within the Zoroastrian legal tradition in the Sassanid Persian Empire, there was an idea that the ideal age of marriage or marital consummation was 9. Now this doesn't appear to be the majority position, but it was a position that existed in the Zoroastrian religious tradition. So given that Hisham created this hadith in post-Sassanid Iraq, i.e. he's trying to transmit this hadith to Iraqis, especially Mawali, especially local converts to Islam, it's entirely possible that he wanted to appeal to some kind of local lingering tradition, for example a Zoroastrian-influenced custom, about the ideal age of marriage. That is one possibility. So the idea here is not that Hisham is trying to legitimize a Zoroastrian doctrine. The point is rather that Hisham is appealing to the local customs and local ideals of the people to whom he is trying to transmit the material. There may not even be an awareness that this is, for example, a Zoroastrian tradition. The second possibility is that Hisham is drawing upon Shi'i legal traditions. We can find numerous transmissions in Kufa, among the Shia of Kufa, of legal traditions from their imams stating that 9 or 10, or often just 9, is the ideal age of marital consummation. And it seems to be the Shia to whom Hisham is responding. So in other words, it's entirely plausible that Hisham took the legal doctrines and the legal ideas of the Shia and used it against them in his formulation of this tradition about Aisha's own marriage. And finally, another possibility is that Hisham was modeling this hadith on his own marriage, because there's a report that Hisham consummated his marriage with his own wife when she was a girl of 9 years. However, it should be noted that Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi criticizes this story and says that it's actually a false story. So there's some uncertainty there. But the point is, there are actually multiple potential sources of inspiration for the choosing of 9 specifically as Aisha's age of marital consummation. So overall, when we look at Hisham's context, when we look at the historical context of Hisham in early Abbasid Iraq, we find that his creation of this hadith matches the polemical context and matches various local traditions and the local conditions. There's a good match between the content of the hadith on the one hand and Hisham's historical context in early Abbasid Iraq on the other. So just to quickly summarize then, this hypothesis of Hisham in Iraq as the creator of the marital age hadith is consistent with the absence of the hadith from all early Medinan sources, the absence of all alleged Kufan versions from the Kufan legal tradition, all of the earliest common links being in the same place at the same time, i.e. being in Kufa at the same time as Hisham, all of Hisham's students being Iraqi or having moved to Iraq, and the only two putative exceptions both being aberrant or problematic, i.e. consistent with being a dive on the one hand and the product of some sort of garbled indirect transmission on the other, all of Muhammad ibn Amr's students having been Iraqi, especially Kufan, the fact that Hisham's version is the most widespread, the fact that all versions clearly derive from a single hadith, the fact that Hisham's version uniquely looks like the hadith, the fact that Hisham reportedly became less reliable specifically when he moved to Iraq, the fact that Hisham has motive, and finally, in general, the fact that there is a clear match between the content of the hadith on the one hand and Hisham's context in early Abbasid Iraq on the other. So again, the hypothesis that Hisham created the hadith in Iraq, the hypothesis that this hadith overall originates with Hisham in Iraq, is consistent with and explains all of the evidence. By contrast, any competing hypothesis is going to conflict with some of this evidence. The conclusion that Hisham in Iraq was the creator is the best explanation. And remember, that hypothesis was generated before I had looked at a lot of this evidence. But as new evidence was discovered and as new evidence was evaluated, it consistently held up to this hypothesis. The next chapter in my thesis is essentially a resummation of the findings and conclusions of the two preceding chapters, the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis and the critical analysis, i.e. the successive form critical, geographical, and historical critical analyses, but arranged according to geography and chronology to give a sort of coherent overview of the origins, spread, and diversification of the marital age hadith overall. So in other words, in this chapter of my thesis, I go region by region and I identify the earliest instances of the spread of the marital age hadith to each region, which version of the hadith it was, and how it spread in the region. In the course of this summary, it becomes clear that almost every region got its versions of the marital age hadith from Iraq, and that includes Makkah, even though, again, the hadith allegedly, according to the earliest segments of some of its isnads, originated in Medina. All of the Meccan transmissions of this hadith come from Iraq. I also identify the occasional instances of local dives. So every now and again, as the marital age hadith was spreading across the empire, across the Abbasid Caliphate, some local figures would take the hadith and sometimes they would alter it or improve it or update it or integrate it into some other material. Then they would give it a local genealogy, thereby naturalizing the hadith in their own region, giving it a regional or local isnad. This happened in Egypt and it happened in Syria, for example. In the next chapter of my thesis, I surveyed all of the explicit and implicit judgments of this hadith that I found in early Sunni scholarship, including both declarations of the soundness of some versions of the hadith and also criticisms of some other versions of the hadith. Most of the time, the hadith was just accepted without comment, but occasionally there are some versions that are criticized. So, for example, those versions of the hadith that are ascribed to Abu Ishaq from Abu Ubaidah from his father Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, those versions are uniformly rejected as being raised, as being the product of raising, raf'. However, in this respect, the traditional scholarship came across as quite sporadic or idiosyncratic, because there are a lot of other instances where you find exactly the same data. You find parallel versions of the same hadiths, with some reaching back to an earlier source and some reaching back to a later source, that were just completely uncommented upon or just outright accepted. The raised version of the hadith was actually just accepted as sahih. Overall, it just seems like the early hadith critics simply inherited this material, inherited this hadith from their venerated forebears. since the Hadith critics are the students of the great common links who disseminated this Hadith, for example. Certainly I found no actual arguments in favor of the authenticity of this Hadith, although that's true in general. It's very rare in the early sources that you'll find any kind of explicit argumentation given in favor of the authenticity of a Hadith. Instead, we just have to vaguely infer what their reasoning was based on extremely generic principles that are occasionally expressed across the early Hadith critical literature. In the final chapter of my thesis, I explore some of the broader implications that my research and my conclusions have for Hadith studies and certain theories about the development of Hadith and early Islamic history more broadly. So, for example, I find a huge amount of corroborating evidence in support of Shula and Yanagihashi's chronologies of Hadith transmission. The idea there is that in the early period there's substantial variation, and then the later we go, the less variation we find. And this is exactly the pattern that I find as well, on a massive scale, with substantial variation occurring from the common links to the partial common links, but then much less variation from the partial common links to the extant sources, for example. My research also has a bearing on the debate about the role of common links, since, as we've seen, all of the earliest common links seem to have fabricated their versions of the Hadith. However, I also found that after the common links, fabrication was relatively uncommon, only occurring occasionally with the creation of dives or parallel versions, new versions of the Hadith. However, what I did find was that alterations to Hadiths, and not just paraphrases, but changes to the Matn, changes to details, the addition of elements, alterations to the Isnād, were actually quite common. I also found that there was no correlation at all between thiqat and accurate transmission. So in other words, I didn't find any correlation between a tradience being judged in the traditional sources to be reliable or thiqa on the one hand, and their transmission being accurate on the other hand. What I actually found was that so-called reliable or thiqa tradients were just as guilty of alteration and interpolation and sloppy transmission as all the other tradients. In general, accuracy and transmission did not correlate with a judgment, but instead correlated with the rise of writing. So what I found was that from the 9th and especially from the 10th century onward, the transmission of material became much more precise, and especially from the 10th century onward, it was almost verbatim transmission. However, the earlier we look, the greater the level of variation, and between the common links and the partial common links, often entire elements were being added or omitted. Finally, the big question. What bearing does any of this have on the claim or the idea that the Prophet Muhammad married Aisha when she was a child? I actually think that my research has very little bearing on this idea. Or to be more precise, you don't need my research in order to cast doubt on that story. I actually agree in a sense with Salahuddin al-Idlibi, in the sense that even if this hadith really traced back to Aisha, I think it would be reasonable to reject it, to think that it's not an accurate memory. However, this is not based upon some conflicting, more authentic hadith that generates, a chronological contradiction with the marital age hadith. Instead, this is based upon the fact that the kind of information that Aisha is allegedly recalling and transmitting is very unlikely to be the sort of information that was accurately preserved or remembered even by Aisha herself. And this is just due to the nature of stateless societies and rural societies, by which I really mean societies that don't have systematic written scholarship and don't have bureaucratic traditions. It's only with the rise of these kinds of institutions that information like the year that someone was born and how old they really are recorded. But in societies without that infrastructure, it's actually extremely normal for that sort of information not to be recorded. In fact, it's very difficult to record. If you don't have systematic written transmission, if you don't have personal diaries, if you don't have bureaucratic records, this sort of information is actually very hard to retain. And so it's actually very, very common in rural and stateless societies that people are all around the world, and even into the contemporary era, it's very common that people in those kinds of societies have no idea how old they are. They don't know the year in which they were born. And we can clearly see this kind of problem affecting even the early Islamic period. As I mentioned, this sort of systematic keeping of chronology and dating and so on actually only arose even according to the Islamic tradition, during the reign of Omar, for example. And if we look at the absolute sort of profusion of conflicting chronologies that we find for the earliest period of Islamic history, especially for the life and times of the Prophet, it becomes clear that this is indeed the case. And even, for example, for the Prophet, there are all kinds of conflicting ages that are assigned to him and years of birth for him. And so it seems very unlikely that even Aisha herself would have known what year she was born and how old she was. It was just not the sort of information that people would or even could retain. And by the time that Aisha was thinking about it decades later, it was too late. If she hadn't have specifically retained that information when she was younger, she couldn't recover. In other words, even if Aisha had a strong memory, which some people claim, that wouldn't help because you can't recall information that you never memorized. So in other words, even if the hadith really derived from Aisha herself, there would be strong reason to doubt that it is a genuine historical memory. So in that sense, I don't think that my research actually has much of a bearing on the historical question of whether Muhammad married Aisha when she was a child, because I think that even if the hadith really went back to Aisha, you would still end up with a similar conclusion of not knowing exactly how old she was. So of course this raises then a final question. Well, how old was Aisha actually then? Do we have any idea how old she was when the Prophet married her, and especially when her marriage was consummated with the Prophet? And the short answer is no. There's no clear answer to that. I don't think one can infer, as I've already mentioned, all of these arguments that try and infer Aisha's actual age from this or that alternative hadith. I just think that's completely unsound for the reasons I've already outlined repeatedly now. So the only thing we have to go off would be, for example, a kind of very general prior probability about the average age of marital consummation or minimal average age of marital consummation in pre-modern societies. If you look across ancient societies and medieval societies, it seems like the normal age for marital consummation was around 14. So if indeed Aisha's marriage to the Prophet was the first of her marriages to actually be consummated, we might infer on the basis of extremely general prior probability that she was 14 at the time. But this is, again, based on an extremely general prior probability. There's just no way to know for sure. That brings us to the end of the presentation, so I'll just give a quick summary of the basic points that we've covered, and then we'll bring this to a close. So I defended the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis. I defended a rigorous and systematic and falsifiable version of the Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, and then I applied this in order to try and identify and reconstruct the earliest versions of this hadith, the hadith of the marriage of Aisha to the Prophet at a young age. And once I was able to reconstruct this hadith back to its earliest identifiable genuine common links, I then applied those results, the results of that Isnād-cum-Matn analysis, to successive critical analyses, and through all of that it became clear that the probable originator of the hadith, the articulator of the ultimate hadith that lies behind all of the extant versions of this hadith, was Hisham ibn Urwa, who moved from Medina to Iraq, and it was in Iraq, in the polemical context of early Abbasid Iraq, that he created and disseminated this hadith, and from him it spread to his contemporaries in Iraq, and then from them all around the empire to all of the different provinces. Hisham's motivation behind the creation of this hadith appears to have been to defend Aisha from criticisms of the Shia who predominated in Iraq, Hisham being both a proto-Sunni and thus having an ideological allegiance to Aisha, but also being a member of Aisha's family and thus having a personal or familial reason to defend his great aunt. The hadith served to emphasize Aisha's young age at the time of her marriage and marital consummation, which in turn served to highlight her status or to bolster her status as a virgin, which is to say the Prophet's only virgin wife. Although some versions of the hadith were criticized by the proto-Sunni hadith critics, many other versions were just accepted without comment, and ultimately these versions became part of the Sunni hadith canon. Ultimately, though, I don't think that any of this has much bearing on the historical question of whether Muhammad married Aisha when she was a child, since I think that even if the hadith was authentic in the sense of going all the way back to Aisha, we would still have good reason to doubt its genuineness as a historical memory. Alright, well, thank you for listening, and if you want to find more of my material, you can find me at my blog, IslamicOrigins.com, on Twitter, at Islamic Origins, and finally, you can find me on Patreon, at patreon.com/Islamic Origins. I guess that's it for now, so thank you for listening.